I'm going to share my screen. And we're super excited about Jingdezhen today. And here we are. Okay, so today, like I said, what I would like to discuss is a region in China called Jingdezhen. So last time we visited Yixing, China, which was, pretty close by train, but to Shanghai. But Jingdezhen, let's say it might take 6 to 8 hours to drive there from Shanghai. So you can see it on that map. This is the birthplace of porcelain. So when we think about clay bodies through history and for thousands and thousands of years, pots were made where there was clay. That's we didn't have all these global shipping problems that we have today. So porcelain was a type of clay that was found in this region of China, and for thousands of years, it was the only place that you could find this type of clay. In fact, it wasn't until the 16 or 1700s, and I won't talk too much about the Silk Road today, but up until the 16 or 1700s, there was nowhere else in the world that people had found this type of clay. They couldn't figure out how to make it. So it was very special to this region. And then for the last few hundred years, people all over the world have been imitating it because it's so special. So this is the images I'm going to show today are from a study abroad trip that I took with industrial design students a couple of years ago. And so this is one of the towns that we went to. We stayed just a couple of nights there. And it's an interesting mix of old world and modern. So you have to remember that, pottery is thousands and thousands and thousands of years old. And this town has built its entire life blood on it. Thousands of family, millions of people. So this is just a scene from a typical road in Jingdezhen where it would just be pottery shop after shop after shop after shop. So the whole community is probably built on thousands of years of pottery shards. So it doesn't matter what little shop you're walking by, there's somebody working and making. So here on the left, you can see actually a guy popping out some pots from a mold. So the white is plaster and that peachy color is the clay. A guy on the right in the same shop, just cleaning parts up. So even though we could make pots from molds and we think, oh, we're going to get the same form over and over again, there's still a ton of handwork. And I think that this will definitely show you that. There is quite a lot. Okay, let's keep going. Okay, I like this just because it's random shops just down the road. And they're like loading up this giant ceramic figurine. It looks to me like it's about headed for a temple. Looks like a Buddhist guy to me, maybe a god or something. So, just random things that you see on the street. I took the students to a workshop that was meant for student participants, and you can see inside of this, there's like a little West Virginia University alcove. So Jingdezhen is known worldwide, and people will come to stay there to study. So you might stay for a residency for a few weeks, a month or 2 months, or maybe even longer. And so universities have different studios in that area that they can send their students to on a regular basis. So all around the town, our plan for visiting Jingdezhen was basically looking at a variety of different studio types and studio places. And so most of these images I'm going to show are from inside studio shops. So it's partially, maybe I'm loving like something about the architecture, but these are like a lot of the entrances. So everywhere there are pots, everywhere there are screens made of ceramics, and every little building you pop into, someone is working. So this woman is painting on the surface. When we talk about Jingdezhen, the most common ceramics that you see from there is this white porcelain with blue painting. And a lot of times you can't tell the painting looks brown or black at first, but then when it fires, some of that extra material burns away, and what's left is the cobalt. So anything that you see that's in that blue and white ware has cobalt painted on the surface and probably a clear glaze. So again, just inside of this courtyard, so you can see the city around us, but this is the courtyard of this large ceramics facility that we were visiting. Some of the sculptures in the yard, planters. I love roof tiles. I could probably do a whole slideshow just on roof tiles. Just super in love. It was spring. It was about the same time of year. And so everything was just starting to leaf out. Here you can see these are like roof tiles put together with grout, kind of holding them into this flower shape. So there was these piercings throughout all of these walls in this way, patterned with tiles and such. So we visited, I had a friend who went with us. Her name is Ling Wen. She studied at the Technical University in Jingdezhen, and she had many friends who still lived there. And a lot of folks stay in the area, and then they study, and then they work at their family businesses. So this was a family business, a friend of a friend. And so you can see on the left, these are plaster molds, and perhaps you can see the negative spaces inside of them. And on the right are some of the sculptures that would have been made out of molds like this in this particular shop. So it was a pretty good sized shop, and they were doing really pretty good sized sculptures in a lot of ways. There were a few small things, but a lot of them were almost torso sized. And so they had pretty big cavity molds. So when we talk about mold making, we use liquid slip, and I'll show you more pictures of this. But if you can see here, she's actually using slabs and pressing plastic clay down into the mold. So it's so big, they're not using liquid and pouring the mold in and out. They're filling the cavities on each side with plastic clay. And here's another one. You can see here, this fella is like pushing it in with his hands, and then it's kind of bubbled up around the seam. So there's extra material. And then they're gonna put those two mold pieces together to make these large sculptures. So they're pretty good section. Here you can see one of them that's just come out of the mold basically, and they're starting to kind of clean it up. You can see where they're scratching on it and stuff. I think this is actually a pull to hold up the horn. So while it's wet, it's kind of holding its shape. So it needs to be soft enough that you can push the mold together and that the clay joins, right? That you can seam seal it. But with a cantilever that long, it'd be really common for it to tip down, or perhaps the neck to cave in a little bit from the weight. And so, they're just kind of supporting the form as they go. And here, this lady is cleaning up that seam. So that last one you saw was kind of rough and mottled. And so here she's using one of those wooden tools to clean up the seam and to really smooth out the surface. So this is a all-day job, all-day work. So there's probably 4 or 5 pictures from every location, and then we'll pop to another one. So after walking around that little facility, we popped out into an alley, and here we are walking around into the next shop. This is kind of what like a raw storage would look like. So this is all raw clay that's been broken up and can be reclaimed. You can see there's a couple of different kinds. Everything was a shop. So this is the entrance, and then walking in here, this is a slipcast facility for sure. So what you see in this bucket shape, that is where the liquid clay is. And so a lot of times these companies will have like large vats of liquid clay, so you can mix and then you can pour or dump out of it. This place was pretty wild. They were making like found objects almost. So can you see that they look like soap dispensers in the back, and like Rubik's cubes and shoes and stuff? And so it was not exactly clear to me what all of these things were going to be. It was almost like pop art in a way. I'm not really sure, but you can see here he has a 2-piece mold, and it's put together with a strap, and he's using that big bucket to pour the liquid clay in. And that liquid clay sits on the surface of the mold and dries, as you know, even from our press molds and our drape molds. But then after a little while, excess liquid is poured back out, and then you just have a shell of an object that is the shape of that mold. So you can see he has lots of molds tied together, and he's going around, he's pouring them all at one time. And then let's say you leave that slip in there from 20 minutes on to an hour, depending on your plaster, the clay, how dry the atmosphere is, and then you dump it all out. So you can reuse the clay that comes out of the mold, which is nice. If it's liquid, when it dries, it's a little bit hard to reclaim it. So here you can actually see his molds are upside down on this red bucket, and so they're slowly draining. So it sticks across the slip bucket, and then those molds are slowly draining back into that big bucket so he can use it again. And this guy is popping one of the pieces out. So it's stiffened up enough, it's hollow. He's gonna break the mold apart, pop the piece out, and then trim off that extra. And depending on how fancy it is, you know, people are more or less you know, picky with how that seam looks. So here are some of those pieces, and you can tell they haven't been cleaned off at all. So that part line is a thing. That happens in all multi-piece molds. So it's something that you have to plan for. And here I think it's actually good for you to see how rough it can be. But that stuff is really easily trimmed at a leather hard stage. And one day I'll take us to Homer Laughlin and we'll see some guys there trimming some of those pieces. More mold shops. So walking down the street, piles and piles of molds in use. The studio spaces are so small that they store things outside under tarps because they're making so many pots. Here, I think in the background, you can actually see this guy's wearing like a face mask and gloves. I think he has like a tiny little spray booth in there. These little bottles that look like colored water bottles down here by his feet, those are glazes. That's a pretty common way for glazes to come. I mean, I'm sure you could probably order powder, but all the times that I have been there, I've ordered it. If it's pre-mixed, it comes liquid in these little tiny bottles. So looking inside of a shop, these guys are actually, that's a kiln cart. So they're loading up hundreds and thousands of pieces on these kiln carts and pushing them in. So thousands of pieces. And then that thing has wheels. So you don't have to like crawl really deep. Imagine having to crawl inside of a kiln and put pots way back on that shelf and then crawl back out of it with like hundreds of times to fill the kiln. It'd be terrible. And so that metal box is probably, you know, what they're gonna like roll those kiln shelves into. Oh, a break. We went to lunch. So just a little cultural tour. This is us at lunch. So it's a little bit fancy, but eating family style is really common. Having tiny little plates, so it's not like Americans where we get these like massive, giant, enormous single servings and then you end up taking 2/3 of it home or whatever. You get these little tiny plates and little tiny bowls, and then you order lots and lots of dishes. I find the culture there to be extremely generous, and they want you to be well fed. And so we would order all these dishes, and then it's on this giant Lazy Susan. So that big glass thing is literally a giant Lazy Susan, and it just goes around and around and around. And this day and age, you would definitely want to have serving chopsticks, and then you take the serving chopsticks and you put the food into your own little plate, and then you eat just a little bit at a time. Keep tasting. So it was fantastic and very unusual, but just kind of modern China life. And I love doors. I told you before, and I want to explain these little lions. There's very commonly, you find lions on either side of the door, and they're very protective, and they're male and female. And you can tell which one is which because the female almost always has a tiny lion cub that she's protecting or is running around her feet. And the male lion almost always has a ball. And so you can kind of tell the difference between them. I think it's funny in the United States when people buy them and then they like buy, you know, like 3, and you think, 3? Why 3? Why'd you get 3? Okay, this guy was making cabbage. That's right. He is casting a giant head of Napa cabbage. So if we play around with this project for the next couple of weeks, I'm going to encourage you to maybe find some found objects if you can get some access to plaster. If you want to try, this guy is casting cabbage. Yeah, crazy. This guy is actually making, he's making like a little lid right there. So he's trying, it's a huge wheel. Yeah, huge wheel. Another little shop, the doors. I love doors. So again, just not enough space inside. Everything's kind of popping to the outside. This guy was inside working and he's painting away. So he has some like a patty of cobalt paint or whatever, and he's painting away. One of the larger sculptures from his studio. Every place was a pottery shop. So look at these big giant planters. And again, with the red on the doors, this was after New Year. So this is pretty common to see New Year's greetings on the door. One of the places that we got to visit was, again, a graduate friend from my friend Lynn Nguyen. And it was way off. Like when we got the address and got dropped off by the taxis, we thought, oh my gosh, where are we going? And then we walked down this crazy road and we met these men who threw pots. And they didn't throw little pots, they threw enormous pots. These pots were huge, hundreds and hundreds of pounds, and they would put 25 pounds on at a time and center it. And it would take 3 guys. That's what's happening there. So it takes so much pressure to center the clay that there's one guy who's kind of directing the movement, and the other 2 guys there are just for force. So they're adding 25 pounds at a time. And here he is opening it up. It's totally crazy. Now, I don't know if this will work. I won't make you try it for long, but I am going to play this video in the background. And maybe every 5 or 10 seconds, you can see these guys working too. But what I can see right now is they're pushing their hands on the middle and pushing it out to the side, trying to center that block of clay like a big disc. And what I can see is they just threw on another big one in there, trying to push it down. All right, I won't make you watch that for too long. We'll try this one though, because this one, they're actually opening it up. So I don't know if you can see this, but he's putting his hand in with lots and lots of water, and he hooks on, and then the next guy hooks on, and then the next guy hooks on, and they're all trying to open it up. So these made really enormous pots. Super enormous, like really big pots. So this is just the bottom of the pot. They made the pots in half, and then they would stack them together. So it would take 4 guys to lift it, and here they are lifting it up and putting it on a cart, and then they're rolling that cart out of the shop and into their holding stage. So they've made all of these bottoms of pots, and then they'll stack another part on top of it and then make these like super huge planters that you see over on the other side. Pretty crazy. Here you go. Here you can see on the left side, this is just his normal working studio. So this is the clay that's waiting for him for the rest of the day to throw. Pretty insane. This was the shop next door. So this guy, these to me all look like probably thrown pots. But what he's doing right there with the gloves on is he has a tiny little scrubber. And because porcelain has such fine particles, you can scrub the surface just super smooth. So that's one of those like green scrubbies you'd use on your dishes. That's definitely a tool I keep in the studio. Here we are just cruising down the street, and this is what the street looks like. Like every place you go has pottery. This is another graduate friend of my friend Ling Nguyen, and that's her and her son. And this guy runs his own little shop and is known for his painting. So these are some of his pots outside of his studio, getting ready to get decorated. Here's some inside. So you can see these white porcelain. So it's looking, some of the work looks a little bit tan at first, I know, but porcelain all coming out with this blue. So the painting you see kind of goes on like black, but when it fires, that extra material fires out, and it's a brilliant blue. You can see it has a book there for reference. So that's pretty common to look at historical work for ideas about what to paint and how to paint. So by doing this, you're really studying technique and imagery and storytelling. So that's pretty common. And here he is painting on the bottom. I have a teapot by this guy, but unfortunately, literally every single piece of Jingdezhen ware I have is sitting in my office. So if you ever get to go back to school, you can look in my office window and I have samples of this guy's work there. So yes, just zooming through the streets, pots, pots, pots. So we talk about making a couple of pots, like I ask you to make 3 pots or 10 pots. And then you think, if I was a production potter, how many pots would I be making in a day? You'd be making hundreds of pots in a day. Pretty common scene. So tarp, it was a rainy day, tarp over the pots, having them outside drying. Lidded vessels, piles and piles and piles of jars. Probably some kind of tea jar. Big molds, little funny cart, and then look up here, all these pots on the 2nd floor. I mean, just thousands and thousands. This whole city is dependent on this. Beautiful little pots. Okay, so a couple more from the street. You guys see that guy working way back there in his shop? Oh yes, I think we're about to pause and go to a different place in Jingdezhen. So I think this is the last slide from walking around the street and seeing this guy's moving his pots down to the kiln. So a lot of times they have shared firing spaces. Yeah, okay. So before I hop to the, oops, I did it anyway. Went to the university. I'm just gonna pop out for a second. Let me see my chats. I'm so glad you're all here. Some folks are having trouble with their video. If you're making those large pots, how many would you make in a day? I'm trying to think. We probably watched him make the bottom half of that large planter for 30 minutes. So, you know, maybe you could make the parts for, you know, if it was 2-parted, does that mean you'd make like 10 a day if you were working 10 hours a day, something like that? So just from how long it took him to make that half, that's, I don't think you could make, I don't think they were making more than 10 of those a day. So, okay, so we are going to zoom over to the technical university. So of course they have a fantastic ceramics university there. And this was just a couple pieces from a faculty show. Some really weird stuff, some kind of interesting. So traditional sculpture forms, a lot of them had sort of a modern take to them. This is pretty traditional. So you see the blue and white ware, and then red comes with this. When you fire in reduction, you can use copper and it turns this brilliant red. So there's a few companion colors that you might see with this work. They're usually fairly primary in nature. So red and yellow and a little bit of green is something that you might see as a companion to the blue, maybe black. Traditional form with more modern glaze on it, butterflies. And these are the students at the school. So I hope you're seeing an image with these women painting. So they have pictures that they're going from. They're using color references, so they're trying to color match, which would also be really important for making consistent work. You can imagine if you were painting for production pottery. And so maybe like me, you've seen me steady my hand on things. So she has this wooden board, so she's not dragging her hand across the surface. And so there's pencil marks on there kind of helping her paint, and then she's going back and painting. But you wouldn't want to drag your hand across the powdery surface. You could definitely smear the pencil marks or your own work. So again, looking at references, painting, painting, painting. the studio, they were also, you know, making some work. So there's some plates that you're using as almost like fabulous canvases, but of course, learning how to paint on a three-dimensional surface is something else. So leaving the university and going a little bit outside of the city center, this is just a residential scene inside of, right outside the thickest part of the city. You can kind of see maybe barely some of this blue and white in the back. The city was covered with porcelain decorations, like land art, into the hillsides, into the walkways. Everything had remnants of this blue and white ware. So this is leading up to their folk museum. They have this pottery shard like channel running across a plaza in front of it. So this is sort of the entrance area, one of our former students, and this ceiling of pottery, just the ancient forms, I think mostly as an art installation now. There were a lot of ceramic columns. So this work, I don't know that I have any pictures of besides the flower pots, of like the super large, like architectural size, like lamp posts and street lights, lanterns that were, you know, 3 times, 4 times the size of a person. So yeah, sculpture and art everywhere embedded in the city. So we're walking into a folk art village where they're trying to keep some history alive. So there was a lot of ceramic installations in this area, a lot of old buildings that had been restored. Here you can see some of the larger vases. That's probably like shoulder height, the tallest one in that picture. They had temple inside of this area. So mixing art with the sacred seemed pretty common. And here's one of the workshops inside of that area. So production pottery zone. Here's a fella, he probably makes 1,000 of those cups a day. So he's throwing them off the hump, putting them onto these wear boards, and then they're just stacked up behind him. So hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these cups. And then those get turned into export ware. So these are thousands and thousands and thousands of those tea bowls, hand painted with that cobalt on the outside, stacked and ready for some sort of distribution. I thought this was really lovely, these ceramic tables and ceramic stools. So this is all ceramic, different ceramic furniture, painted with the cobalt, just really gorgeous work, really large scale. And here are some of the folks from that folk village painting on the surface of some of these large pots. This fella is piercing, so he's cutting through the surface while it's still a little bit workable. Painting more imagery. This one was pretty detailed, 3-dimensional carving on the surface. So I'm not even sure how long it would take for someone to make a vessel like this. It was very slow going. So they had tons and tons of folks making pots, really large vessels, all painted in this blue and white ware. So outside of one of their little gift shops. Pretty common traditional shapes, big bellies, shoulders, all different proportions of necks, feet, just about anything you could imagine. Even their trash cans were made out of clay. They're recycle cans. This is inside of kiln building. So this next big thing that you're going to see, this is like probably some of this shelter is to preserve the kiln, but it was enormous. You can see the chimney stack coming out of the back of this building. And this is the interior of the kiln. Cavernous. It was cavernous. A huge structure. Would have taken days to heat up. And here are some of the smaller kilns that would have come after something like that. You can see the chimney stacks rising. And just a couple more pictures from around that area. Beautiful walkways, really interested in the textures and the linear aspects of the pathways next to the trees, hiding in the woods. Really common again to see like these inscriptions on the wall. Perhaps they're telling stories of famous potters, or they're explaining their own theory about pottery or the beauty of ceramics. A vase cutout window. And I think we're getting near the end of this folk village. So this is called like a boathouse, and this is pretty common architecture where they would make a stationary, someone would build a stationary building as if it was a boat floating over the water. So you could transport yourself to almost another time and place. And this would have been a gathering place and perhaps having like performances, singing or theater of some kind. And of course, at this village, they had these ceramic bells. And so that was like there's ceramic wind chimes, different drums and stuff. So that was like a theater for music made all from ceramics of this village. Yep, I think this is coming to the end of this whole section. And I'll stop here. So just blue and whiteware. So I don't think I've seen any questions pop up, but I'll go back and check. I want to explain a little bit about the process of slip casting, but I thought I would just show you, because we've been, I've been working with decorating some of these faces for you guys while we're working together. I thought I would just show you a few of the things that Jingdezhen inspired me with. If there's time for a demo today, I'm going to try and, I have my own plum blossom pattern, and so I'm going to try and put that on. I thought this was this tea bowl was a good example of like the branch work and the flower blossoms that I'm going to try and recreate my own style. And then I'm also thinking about auspicious clouds, and I'll show you my auspicious clouds, and they don't look like this, but they look like mine, and dragons. My next challenge is what to do about a dragon motif. So look at this with these crazy dragon handles. Oh my gosh. And then I liked this one because it has the flowers that I like a lot around the banding, around the edge. So it's not a very detailed picture, but I get it. It's enough for me to get it. And then this one I thought was fun because after our last conversation with the teapots, it's kind of like a wine ewer. And so I think liquid can actually come out of that sculptural spout on the side. But it had a pretty funky dragon, so I'm gonna look at that one too. Oh, and this one had this weird blue background. These are dragons looking like straight at you. And look at the handles. So those are kind of like cloud handles. So you see where I'm going with this. Anyways, I'm gonna take a break. I see a couple questions, and then I'm going to go back. Here's my chat. Okay. I can email you the videos after class. I finally figured out how to record this one today, so hopefully we'll have even more resources. Bobby wants to know if I ended up adding handles or feet to my moon pot. Yes, I did, and I will show you when we get to the end of this slideshow. Oh, Savannah says she added both. She saw them. Okay, so I think we're doing pretty good. Let me see what time it is. 11:36. Oh yeah, we're doing great. All right, so I want to talk to you for just a few minutes about slip casting. So this would have normally been our last project for the semester. So slip casting is the opportunity, just like with our tiles and with our drape mold, a way to make a form over and over and over again. So we would be using a plaster mold and liquid clay to make hollow vessels. So the first project we did was the press mold with the tiles, and that was a solid, right? A one-piece mold, solid, press it in and it pops out. The second was the drape mold. So it has a section to it that's more vessel-like, but a lot of those had to be low and open. And we've talked about how to we're using them now as parts to make other kinds of pieces, but the drape mold specifically because of the way the plastic clay wraps around the mold, can't have too steep a sides or it starts to fold over on itself. Whereas slip casting is really good for vessels. And although I could probably throw this one, you know, I could imagine in an industry setting, you don't want to hire, you know, hundreds of potters to be throwing on the wheel. So, you know, this would be one way to make something really, really consistent. So one of the things that we would do in class is definitely talk about whether or not we're making a one-piece mold or a two-piece mold. So our tile molds and our drape molds are all one-piece molds because the way that the clay wraps around the form, it can easily release in one single direction. If you, because slip casting can allow you to make forms that are not easily made on the wheel, maybe it's tall and skinny, or maybe it's squared off or some other kind of weird shape, there may be parts of the form that can't release easily from the mold. And so the bottom of this image is demonstrating a vase that would need a two-part mold. The mold would have to release from the sides because you could never pull the vase out from the top without damaging some part of the mold. And we talked about that specifically related to our tile molds, making sure we didn't have texture that was going to rip off as we were popping our tiles out. So this is just an image from the Empty Bowls class. I have a couple from Empty Bowls to show you what I want us to start with. So anybody who would like to follow along in a non-graded project, you're welcome to try and make a one-piece mold. So these are bowl molds, and all of these molds, so right there you can actually see I've already poured the clay into that mold in the front and dumped the excess out. And so now that soft clay is just sitting inside of that mold drying. And when it pops out, it's going to become one of these bowls in the background. And this is looking down into a mold that's getting ready to have plaster poured on it. So here you can see half of a bowl, and it's trapped inside of a box. So you remember making your tile and building a box around it and pouring plaster in. Well, this Stephanie, this young lady, was making half a mold for a really faceted bowl. So she 3D printed half of it and stuck it in her box and poured plaster over it. And then we took that apart, and then she made another mold just like that. And now she's using those two halves together to make one bowl. So that was 3D printed and has Bondo and paint on the outside to make it so nice. And so just like the tile molds, you're just pouring that plaster right on top of whatever that is. And here you can see we're using aluminum flashing with clay around the bottom to make a round mold. So probably that bowl is round, and just to not get an excessive amount of plaster, we've wrapped it with aluminum flashing, and that's gonna make a round mold. And I'll show you a round mold here in a second when I pop off of my slides. These are just some examples of some of the pots that came out of Empty Bowls, because these are all super simple one-piece molds. So this original form would have been made out of clay, a solid block of clay, and then cast in plaster. And here you can see, because her form has clarity, so it's just a three-sided pot, she was able to use all of these multiples that she made to test glazes. So she did a lot of different glaze testing, and she also changed the rim on almost every single one. So there was a lot of opportunity to explore personal expression, even in a mold-made part. So all of these pieces have to be hand trimmed when they come out of the mold. And so it's really easy to kind of detail each one if you wanted to individually. There's another lovely one-piece mold that came out of that set. This was from Danny Perry. And you can see this beautiful little curve on the bottom. So this was like a tripod bowl, and he had the most elegant little curves lifting the pot off the table. Super easy to pop out of a one-piece mold. This is a student that made a two-piece mold, and I just wanted to kind of go through some of the process of how you might make one of these molds. So he's actually turning wood on the wood lathe. So that's, you can make your positives out of raw clay, out of 3D prints, out of wood, out of plaster, even out of plexiglass or other kind of board material. It's all a matter of whether or not in the end what the surface is like and whether or not it's porous, how well it works. So he's turning it on the lathe, and then he made it into a two-part mold, casting one half, like you bury one half in clay, pour plaster over the other half, flip the whole thing over, remove the clay, cast the other half. And then these dots are keyholes, and they lock the molds together when you're ready to pour, so that the two halves always line up in the same way. Here he is tying the mold together. And you can use straps. Some ratchet straps work as long as they don't cut into the plaster. And then a lot of times I use old inner tubes from bicycle tires because they're soft and they don't really damage the plaster, and they're stretchy, so you can tie them really tight. Here he's pouring the liquid clay in. So we keep this in buckets in the studio, and there's clay there if the school ever opens back up. Pouring the liquid clay in, and it's drying. And so this is what it looks like, what's happening inside of that. So you have a hollow mold. You pour the liquid clay inside. That liquid clay dries on the surface, and the longer you leave it in, the thicker the section. And after some certain amount of time, you pour out the excess, and what's left is just that shell of what was touching the plaster. And then the mold pops off, and you have this hollow form waiting for you. So here this guy is pouring it back out. And you can see a little bit along the edge how thick that section is. And it's something that you would time. I would take a timer so that every time I make a pot, it's always the same section as the pot before. So here his piece popped out of the mold, and you can see the seam line still needs to be cleaned up. So again, the longer you leave the clay in, the thicker the section will be. So that's a way to kind of, you can get these pots so thin that they don't want to take glaze. They're not thirsty enough. There's not enough literally material there to kind of absorb glaze, so they can be really fragile. They're also not made under compression. So if you bend them at all, they warp easily because there's no compression on the particles. They're all in crazy different shapes and angles and inside the actual wall of the clay. And so they warp really easy, warp inside the kiln. So just wanted to show you just a couple more of some mug molds. So this actually, because of the way it has this bottom divot, you know, sometimes mugs on the bottom will have sort of like a negative space underneath them. That couldn't come out of the mold to the side, so it actually makes a three-piece mold. It's called a biscuit, sticks in the bottom of the piece. Just showing the trim line. So you can cast handles in place. Some people cast them on the side and then they'll attach them. This is actually a handle cast in place. And then you would have to do some trimming to get rid of all of that part line information. Here you can see they're even casting a spout in place. So the handle's cast in place, the spout's in place. And to keep it hollow, that opening for the spout has to reach all the way to the outside of the mold, but all of that's going to be cut off. So it's like a sprue hole. So in like injection molding or something, you might have some vents off the side of the mold so air can go out. You don't trap air bubbles. The same thing's happening here. This is a place for that clay to exit so that the spout stays hollow. If it wasn't, then the spout would close up. It would, if there was no place for the clay to go out and air to go out, the end would close up. You'd have to drill through it. And depending on that shape, you can get yourself into some trouble with making multi-part molds. So this has such deep facets. This is actually probably like a 4-part mold, I think. I'm reading 4 parts on that, at least, to kind of get those different pieces off. So casting section by section. And I think I just have a few more examples for you. So I haven't seen any questions pop up, but I just want to show you a couple more examples of scenarios because we can't be together and kind of touch the samples I have from my office. So this is actually if any of you remember the 50th anniversary cup for the college, this is it being turned out of plaster and being turned into a mold. So the most common, I'm not going to say the most common, a really common way in the dinnerware industry to make molds is to actually start with a solid block of plaster because you can machine it like wood or metal, but it's softer. You can sand it down perfectly, but it does hold up the tooling. So you could drill into it or CNC it, anything like that. So you get a really nice surface. But it's kind of durable. Here they are trying to make the engraving for the bottom of the cup. casting it in plaster. And here's Ellen and her super hip glasses visiting the factory that's actually making the cups for us. So we made about 25 molds. And then this Emerson Creek Pottery up in Bedford actually made the cups for us. That's looking down inside of the molds. And I have some of these in my office if you ever want to see them. These really nice little plastic inserts for their the connectors of the mold, the key slots. And then you can see the biscuit in the bottom because it had that 50th engraving. We couldn't slide the cup out sideways. That biscuit has to come out first. Here's a bunch of the cups getting ready to get fired at Emerson Creek. So it is so fun to see so many made. It's addictive. I love making pots. No such thing as too many pots. So here's the cup. It had this wonderful little finger indentation for you to hold. And there's the 50th anniversary sign on the bottom. Came through the glaze just fine. Okay, here's a couple wacky molds. So we're transferring from things that I've done to things that could be crazy. This is called a pixel mold, and it's a bunch of plaster on these little tiny poles, and then they're changing their position inside of this like box. And then every time they're pulling out these kind of wacky pieces that are different shapes or different configurations of those pixels because they can change the mold each time. Kind of bizarre. Some eggs. This is a really good place to start. If you want to try two-piece molds, I'm a big fan of hard boiling an egg. Try and find the halfway mark. This is a lovely place to start. There's actually crazy casting of a bone, a part of a thigh bone, I think, from pork chop or something. This is kind of a weird piece. So a lot of what I'm showing is definitely not traditional like Jingdezhen. This is like a modern piece. It's almost like the mold is revealed with this vase. Very bizarre. I hope you can see now a set of vases with these different surfaces. So this would be something that would be super fun if you were to cast a piece, is to experiment. This is a great way to experiment with surface decoration because you can do a comparative analysis across this one form about what happens with that surface decoration. So, but these were kind of playful, tall and skinny. That's hard to throw. That's why you find a lot of tall, skinny things that are made from casting. Hard to make in other ways. Here are these pots. You could certainly make them out of slabs, but they're meant to be intentionally sculptural. They're actually kind of pasted together, like pots that, a mold that's been sliced and then sandwiched together from different molds. Just some kind of conceptual work. Some light fixtures. So especially with porcelain, you can actually cast thin enough that the material is almost translucent. So light fixtures is a really interesting opportunity for ceramics. Here's another one. So pretty highly detailed surface. That's something you could easily 3D print. It would be really hard to hand carve with that kind of detail. Again, just another light fixture shell, definitely cast. These are kind of interesting light fixtures in that the clay was colored and it was poured into the mold in successive layers and then trimmed through. So where it's trimmed through, of course it's thinner, so more light is going to come through, but it's also a different color. So it glows in these different little orb looking objects. So you can alter the material once it comes out of the mold. This is kind of interesting. It's a little bit like the decals well, these are decals. It's kind of like the screen printing I use. I have a guest coming for us next Thursday. Her name is Stacy Snyder, and she's going to do some decal work for us. So that should be exciting. You'll see how those images are transferred onto the surface. These last few images probably have to do with some computer-generated technology entering the workflow. So this is someone who was doing some conceptual work. They actually were using a computer program to generate ripples across water, as if you were blowing across your tea to cool it. And so he captured what would be the ripple of the water in the clay as opposed to the tea. So those would have been 3D printed and slip cast. And he does a lot of other really bizarre work. His name is Jeffrey Mann. I would look him up if you like weird conceptual work. Here he is. This is these are sound waves across forks, as if someone was yelling at the dinner table and even the silverware heard it. So he has some really weird stuff. Look him up. Okay, this guy is Bowie Croissant. He lives in Kansas City, I think. And this is actually slip cast pieces, but then they're attached together after they come out of the mold. So again, like the way we're using the drape mold as like making different parts, and then we're attaching them together using slip or whatever. This is like a wacky teapot structure, but the actual individual modules are what has been cast. And then every time he makes one of these teapots, he puts them together into these different arrangements. This is also some of the same guy's work. So you can see he's using some 3D print technology to get to his molded pieces. This is really nice. These, to me, I love the linear aspect across these. They almost look like bubbles or seed pod forms or something. And it's kind of surprising. I love the way that glaze collects in it, but when I saw how these things were made, I was just a little bit surprised. The clay softens it so much, but so you can tell that these are stacked masonite boards. They've been cut out in the laser cam, and then he's using that. You'd seal that with polyurethane, and then you could cast a mold out of it. So here you can see that piece cast. So actually, it's probably not the same one. These layers are in a different orientation. But so that would have been made originally from stacked material, laminated together, and then cast. So the inside of that mold is probably a lot softer. You would only get those clean sort of contour lines on the outside, and the inside would, the slip would sort of fill in the negative space in between the parts, and so it wouldn't look as striated on the inside. Again, just kind of working through a little bit of 3D technology and thinking about how people decide on forms. So this is a form that would have been worked out as a flat pattern. You could imagine trying to build that out of a slab. It'd be ridiculous. But in a cast part could really be quite interesting. So using a folding technology in 3D software to generate forms. So it's not that you would make the piece that way, but you're using the capacity for the computer to make flat patterns to help you think through how you are generating form. So I guess I'm just trying to express the overlap. There's a lot of different ways to overlap 3D technology with form giving. And then with so many different ways to make form in ceramics now, there's a lot of opportunity to make new work. So again, this is more laminated. This is actually laminated out of paper. And he's casting a much thinner section, so you can see that texture on the outside of the bowl. And then this is what I'm talking about. The inside is much smoother, so it's not going to take that texture. The slip softens anything that's on the outside, and then, of course, you could smooth it more. And then this is extremely highlighted by that glossy yellow glaze as compared to sort of the matte, rough, raw clay texture on the outside. Another one kind of exploring water dynamics. So something that would have been trapped in the computer as an image, like water droplets on a pond, and then 3D printed and cast as a piece. Here's that same artist working in a vertical format. Those are kind of lovely to me. I think they're all serene. These ones are just a little bit different. This is, so it's interesting to overlap ceramics with mass customization, because I think of ceramics as sort of a peaceful, long, drawn-out process. But when you start to add 3D print technology, things get a little bit wacky. So these are actually 3D printed ceramic vases. So all of these crazy faces are these people actually having their voice recorded, and then based on the sound that they're making, they were captured in sound waves. Those sound waves then generated three-dimensional form. That three-dimensional form was then 3D printed out of ceramic material and fired. So now not only do we use 3D technology to help us design, or 3D technology to help us make molds. This is 3D technology making right in the ceramic material. So each one of these pieces is unique and individual as the sound waves that you might generate while singing. And I think where we're going to end with Jonathan, who is an alumni of our program. And these are some slipcast pieces he made in our studio. They were quite lovely. And one of the things that he did that was a little bit different is that he used a mill to cut directly into the plaster. So he cast a solid block of plaster. So eliminating the step of making a positive, he machined the plaster directly to get to his mold structures. And here this was, you know, kind of early on in the overlap of 3D technology and ceramics at our school. And so one of the things he was interested in are these tool paths. So this almost woven texture is because of the way that he programmed the tool path to cut the plaster, and then it revealed this pattern at the end. So it wasn't, it was pretty well thought out. Here's one of those pieces coming out of the mold. And these are the entry and exit points for where the clay is. So there always has to be some place for the clay to go in and out in the mold. And then here is just one of those final pieces from him, a two-sided mold. Yeah. Okay. Whew, that was it. That was a lot. How are we doing, people? Let's see, do we have any questions over here? Is it easier to achieve a lot of surface texture with a slipcast instead of a press mold? Putting texture into the slipcast piece all has to do about how it pulls out. So the texture can't lead to undercuts. A lot of times, now there are some times when you would definitely want to cast texture in. Sometimes, especially in the context in which we're working, I would work with a more smooth surface and then consider adding texture after it comes out of the mold as an opportunity for decoration and opportunity just to kind of experiment across the forms. But it just, you can add texture to molds. It just depends on whether or not there are any undercuts and whether or not it can pull out of the mold. So it's 12 o'clock now. So I'm just gonna take a couple of minutes to show you some of the things that I brought today. I wanna talk to you about what it would be like if you wanted to think through a one-piece mold. That's something that could be achievable with pretty few materials, but this is a good time to ask questions. So if you have questions about the first part of the lecture, being in Jingdezhen, I'm happy to take those. Or if you want to ask questions about the process that we're talking about for mold making, that would be great too. So I just happened to bring up one of my empty bowl pots from the basement so that we could talk about this. So the first, if you were to try a slip casting at first, like the tile, I would try and have it be a one-piece mold. So if you did sort of like a plate or a low bowl for your drape mold, then you would want to think like, how could I make something that was like a soup bowl or a cup or something that is, you know, a little bit taller and skinnier, you know, something that lent itself to the form. I probably wouldn't recommend something that's low and wide. It's actually a little bit hard. So thinking about something that has the basic shape of a cone is a really good place to start. And so for this mold in particular, I drew a plan view of it. So the base of the pot, I drew that shape, and then the top. And then those were my guides, and I packed clay between them. So that's something I'd like to demonstrate next week. I just want to kind of get some of this vocabulary out in front of you today to see if you're interested in it. But the idea is, like, what could you make out of a one-piece mold that was as close to a cone as possible? Because cones like to come out of molds, right? The more straight-sided it is, the harder it is to get out of the mold. And so this is the mold for that bowl. You can see that it's round. It has a negative space inside of it that I pour liquid clay into. So if I was going to make this mold, you're thinking to yourself, what should I make? First, I would draw what I want, right? You can imagine drawing a bowl or a cup or something, and then I would build it solid. So this one is hollow, but I would turn it upside down on a board, just like we did our tile, and build a wall around it and pour plaster on top. So if you were to try something like this, the first thing you would do is figure out, what is it that I want to cast? Is it a found object? Or is it an object that I'm going to make myself out of another material? That's kind of the first step. So let's see if we have one or two more questions popped up. Yes, Zach, I like your cat too. Super cute. I want to slip cast, but hand making or pinch potting a form presents so many irregularities. It would be difficult to slip cast a smooth, uniform piece. Bobby, are you talking about like how to make the positive? Like, would it be hard to make a smooth, uniform piece as a positive? Because that's a rational question. I think that's what you're asking me. Yes. Okay. So what I'd like to demonstrate next week is maybe how to get to a positive. I think that's something that we could talk about. So now that we're thinking, okay, slip casting, what does this mean? What does this mean? It can be challenging to get to a smooth surface, but patience is your friend, and planning. And so there's going to be a couple of templates that I would make for this pot that would help me get to the smoothest pot possible. Also, because it's solid, anything that I cast, I'm going to make it solid so it doesn't collapse under the weight of the plaster. Plaster is really aggressive. It's easy to shave and carve and get it nice and stiff where the clay wants to respond smooth. So when you work really wet, it's easy to get divots and bad corners. But if we work with the clay at the right moisture content, it's pretty easy to get relatively clean surfaces with patience. And then anything that you pull out of the mold is going to take some hand cleaning. So you can't just expect to pop it out and have it be perfect. So even if there's little undulations in the surface or changes in the corners, those are things that I'm going to clean up with trimming. And even with slip cast pots, it takes me twice as long to trim than it ever does to make the pot. So everything is about patience. But that's why some people do like to make their positives out of material that they can machine. So let's say you were to cast a solid block of plaster, you could cut into it with a saw or sand the surface like you could a piece of wood and get it perfectly straight and perfectly flat. And so thinking about what material you're using also changes how precise that positive can be. So I hope I answered your question there. Yeah. So what else are you guys thinking out there today? So I think making a positive and getting it into like a mold structure is what I'm thinking about for next week. Anything else? Just giving you a pause. I have one or two other things I can show you. Pausing. Are we doing okay? Everybody doing okay? Let's see, let's catch up with some of the other fun things until you come up with other questions. How would you make a biscuit for a 3-part mold? Good question, Jonathan. So if you saw inside of the, if you remember seeing inside of the empty bowls mold where there was only half the bowl, basically that is what you would have to do. Let me see if I have, here, this one will work. So I have this little cup and it has like a little foot on the bottom. So if you can imagine trying to make this out of a mold, you know, I'm going to bury half of the pot in clay and pour plaster on top. But what I would do is I have to seal the top so that there's a hole where the clay goes in and out. And the first time I pour it, the first and second time I pour it, I would actually seal the bottom. So when you're only making half of the mold, it can only cast to the side. So it's casting one side, and then you would turn it over and you would cast the other side. And that means you would have a negative space where the clay goes in and out. You would also have a negative space where the foot is. So the very last thing would be to turn both molds up on its side and maybe cast the bottom. So you would end up casting them in different stages, and you kind of block off the parts of the positive that you don't want the plaster to touch. So you basically hide it, either burying it or pushing it up against a wall, so the plaster can only go exactly on the section that you want it to cast. Yep, okay. Great. So I think the next couple questions are just about reflections. Not yet. You guys can go ahead and start writing them if you want, but I just wanted to show you where I'm at with the moon pots because I'm having fun and you all are my inspiration. So yes, if you remember from the other day, I did add a top and a foot and crazy handles to this pot, and it has the plum blossom pattern on the surface, which I'm really, really liking. But then this last one, I went with a different top. So I have a round top this time instead of the square top. It's a little bit more traditional. And I went for auspicious clouds. So this is what I did after last time's class. I used one of my screen prints. And that's what I want to do today. So I have a new little flower vase today, one of my new little icobonables. And I've already got the white slip on the surface. And last time you saw me screen print onto the green foam, right? And then I pressed the pot onto the foam, or I pressed the pot onto the screen. And this time I've printed on paper. So these are my plum blossoms. I'm printing them on paper. And what I like to do is, this has allowed me to cut out only a little small section, like a shape. So that's how I got the clouds. I cut it out in the cloud shape. And then I'll take this guy and I'll just run him through a little tiny bowl of water. So it starts to soften the surface of the underglaze. And then I lay him on the pot wherever I want him and press him down just gently so he doesn't slide or smear. And then you kind of work it like a transfer tattoo, like one of those temporary tattoos. I just wet the back of it a little bit, and then I'll rub it on with a tool. So it's like, I got to get the underglaze wet so it loosens from the paper. Sometimes I add a little bit more water. You can add so much water that the image smears. So put a little bit of water on there, and then I will rub it in like it's a little transfer tattoo. So these pots are still greenware. The slip is still a little bit damp, and I'm hoping that'll actually help grab the underglaze. You can do this when they're bisqueware. So underglaze is nice because it can go on two different at two different times, when it's greenware, well, three, I guess, bone dry, although it's very fragile and I don't recommend that, and bisqueware. So that's really nice. I'm putting it on the slip so that I can still carve through it. So that's why it's super important for me to do it while it's green, because then I'm going to carve around it to kind of highlight it and add the, I'm going to try and carve the branches. So those aren't printed. I'm going to try and carve them. I don't know how it's going to look. How long does it typically take to get a 1/2 inch section with slip casting? A 1/2 inch. Now that's pretty thick. I usually go for 3/16 to 1/4 inch, and that can take me like 45 minutes to 50 minutes. So if you want something that's a 1/2 inch, I bet it could easily take an hour and a half, 2 hours, depending on how dry your mold is. And then the top won't be level, like it kind of, it sort of shrinks in. And just so you know, you can't pour liquid slip into a mold and then have it cast solid, because what happens is so much moisture comes out, shrinks so much, it'll split and crack. So just in case you were wondering, you cannot use liquid slip to cast solid objects. They fall apart, they crack apart. But you could probably do a 1/2 inch. It'd be really heavy. That's like stone. Yeah, you could do it. Any other questions for today? I'm just gonna rub this on. I haven't pulled it off yet. Any other questions for today? We've got just a couple minutes left in class. So I'm going to stick around to see if you have any questions of your own work. Again, today's assignment is to please leave me a reflection over in the chat today. I would really appreciate it. Next week, on Tuesday, we'll maybe talk a little bit about how to do one of these. Maybe I'll make a solid for us, kind of get it prepped as if it was going to get ready to go into the plaster mold, and go from there. And then, like I said, on Thursday, we're going to have another guest. So that would be something to look forward. Stacy Snyder, you can look her up. She used to live in Blacksburg. Now she lives in Arlington, and she makes great work. So questions or goodbyes, reflections, all of these things are awesome. I hope you have a good day. I miss you guys. I'm going to answer questions as I see them. So somebody wants to know if they can make liquid clay at home. It's a little bit challenging to do that. The clay that I use in the studio, I do have pre-mixed to it's already wet. It is possible to order clay in a dried powder and mix it up. The difference with slip is that it has something in it called a deflocculant. So if you remember, the clay particles are like these little platelets, and they have an electrical charge. So one surface might be positive while the edge might be negative. And that's one of the reasons that plastic clay works the way it was, is like when we push it, it doesn't want to push apart because it actually has electrical charge that's keeping it together. So in liquid slip, what's different is that you add a material called a deflocculant, which actually changes the electrical charge of the clay, and it makes both of them positive, so they repel inside of the water. Normally, if you just take like our clay and get it into a powder and then add water to it, it's eventually going to settle out. So it'll be really heavy on the bottom and liquidy on the top. So it's possible to kind of mix it up. It immediately starts to settle because of that attraction. And so the deflocculant, which can be like sodium silicate, and another brand would be called Darvan 7, and that makes the particles all positively charged, so they want to be away from each other, so they float in the bucket. They never settle because they're always like running away from each other, so that's how that keeps them floating in the bucket. So that's what makes it hard to make at home. So it's possible, but hard. And then it's also why we can't reuse the clay that's dried. So once we pour the liquid clay in and out of the mold, and then there's like maybe trimming or things on the edge of the mold that we have to clean off, those things can't be reclaimed because the ratio of deflocculant to clay and water has been set out of balance. And so you can't just say, oh, I have 14 grams of dry material, I'm gonna add 6 grams of water. The chemistry just doesn't work out that way. It starts to settle out too. So you can, but it's just hard to make at home. One thing I think you could do is, if we make molds, you could press clay into them, kind of like those sculptures. So that would be another way to kind of have fun with your mold. I can also provide the reference for having them shipped to you, just having that material shipped to you. There is some place in DC, I don't know if anybody is in the greater DC area, that's where we have the stuff that's in our studio shipped to us. And I think even our high water clay company was supposed to open up at the end of this week. And so I'm living on the faith that the world won't be closed forever. Yeah. So I hope that answered your question. Any other questions out there? Let's see, back to this guy. screen. Hi, Dad. Are you still there?
Yeah, we're both here.
Yeah.
Okay. Hi. I think you're the only ones left.
Yeah, we were maintaining a low profile. I